can get that on the record.
All right. So to start, let's see. I'll call the roll. Ann Gravitt. I'm not seeing her yet. I'm not expecting Bob Salinger today. Lori Stegman.
Here.
Corky Collier. I'm expecting him to be absent as well. Dave Ritma.
Here.
Eric Mueller.
Yes, here.
Shirley Craddock.
Present.
Eric Molander. James Ellison.
Here.
John Niyama.
Here.
John L. Bell.
Here.
And Mary Helen Kincaid. I just clicked for her to come on in. I'll give her a second to get connected. Michael Jordan.
I'm here.
Steve Fancher.
Here.
Tandy Stephenson.
Here.
And Mary Helen, I see you're present.
I am. I was challenged with the Zoom link, and so, but it worked with the meeting and passcode. So sorry
Okay.
about that.
You
I'm
made
here.
it. That's what's important. Thank you.
So did you get Tony DeFalco? Is he not?
Oh, yeah. And Tony DeFalco's not present either.
Okay. Okay, so it appears we have a quorum, so call the meeting to order. Is there anybody who's signed up for any kind of public communication or testimony?
There is not.
Okay. So the first thing on the agenda, first of all, I guess I should say welcome all of you. I'm glad. I'll make the assumption that you all survived the heat dome. It was just the last of a series of natural incidents that we've all survived. Appreciate you taking the time to be here today. We had the first thing on the agenda for action is the approval of 3 sets of minutes, one from April the 5th, one from April the 19th, and one from May the 17th of 2020, and entertain a motion to approve those.
I'll move to approve the minutes, and I just lost the 3 dates, but
That's great. Thank you, Shirley.
I'll
So-
second. Oops,
And a
sorry.
second by Mary Helen. So all those in favor of approving those minutes, say aye. Or do we don't have to do that for minutes, do we? Okay, just voice.
Yeah, a voice vote is fine.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right, great, thank you. Next item is Mr. Owen on for the Assets and Liability Project.
Right, good afternoon all. You have opportunity to see me twice in a row. Today on the same topic today is about the final assets and liabilities final reports. And let me share my screen with you. You should have received a short summary in your meeting packet along with the full report. I just have a couple of slides just to highlight a couple of items because I know we've had an opportunity to talk about this report during our last meeting, so I didn't want to repeat that if I could avoid it. Share. So are you all able to see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, we can see it, Bill.
Yep, very good. Thanks. Right, so this report is for the most part, the same as what you saw, or at least we described a little bit last time around. The full report, 90 plus pages, is in your packet. But I just want to remind you why we're talking about this at all. And there's two reasons from our vantage point. One, legally, ORS 550, sorry, not 5550, but 550 specifies that your district will assume the duties, assets, and liabilities of the dissolved districts. But per legislation, that's required. But secondly, it also should provide you a fair amount of information regarding your revenue development discussions that are upcoming year in the next several months and over a year. It does specify what the current status of the districts are in terms of its assets and liabilities as related to its annual audits, but also it identifies future asset investments that are needed to modernize the system. And we've talked about the system and what things that are on the horizon that are anticipated in order to step up and create a modern functioning system that supports flood safety and the other objectives that are specified under ORS 550. So what's changed since our last meeting? Well, very little. There is one exception that I'll talk about in the next slide, but the description of the duties are unchanged. You have it, I believe that's in section 2. Accounting of the assets and liabilities as of the last approved auditor's report are unchanged. Those numbers are shown here on this slide, but also in the report. You can see that all the districts' net position are in the black, and the amounts are differing for a variety of reasons. You're happy to ask questions about these, and looks like Nick Hogan, our CFO, is on board here to help answer those questions if need be. But the numbers that you saw during your June meeting are unchanged in the final report. So what has changed? And it's primarily the outlook moving forward. This table is something we added to the final report that wasn't in the previous version, nor in the slides that I had provided. The first three, so these are other considerations or future projections of asset investments that we feel are needed to modernize the system. The first three categories represents work associated with the Corps' Portland Metro Levee System projects, as well as FEMA accreditation and levee certification. The numbers you see here actually have not changed from your June 21st meeting, but the last two items regarding the 20-year projections have changed a bit. And those relate to both major capital improvements that we anticipate that will be needed during the first 20 years of the district's operation, so 2025, 2026, as well. And those capital improvements are defined as projects that are $1 million or higher. 20-year operating capital requirements include ongoing annual capital investments, each of which are less than $1 million. And you can see the number there is a little higher than $1 million per year during that 20-year period. Generally, what you see on the operating capital side primarily is the assets' useful life for a lot of the levee components will be coming to the end of that period of time. And so we're expecting to have a fair amount of rehabilitation and some minor capital improvements during that time. During the second 10-year period of that 20-year horizon, the focus will shift a little bit more towards the internal drainage side, where some of the mechanical and other elements of the pump stations primarily will be nearing the end of their useful life. And so that's what makes up generally what the horizon is for capital requirements. So you can see while even the PMLS projects costs quite a bit of money just for local contributions, up to million. Collectively, we're anticipating between 153 and 167 million during this 20-year period. So those are the only 4 slides that I have to support the meeting materials that you were given, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Bill, before we take questions, the action before the board today is to accept the report. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
So I've toggled over to, and I'm sorry if you can't see this in detail.
Acknowledge receipt.
Right. So acknowledge the receipts of this report from the 4 districts. So that would be the board action.
Okay. That's great. So any questions of Bill?
I do, just because I can't go back to where it might be. But when you said the CIP amounts have changed a bit, what's that mean? Changed
So
more or less or?
yeah, so but the last 2 lines increased from the June 21st presentation to this board. These numbers are the same numbers, Mary Helen, that you saw during your format meeting in the end of June, I think June 29th, June 30th. But for purposes of the urban district board here, they're a little different than their June 21st meeting. And so the 20-year major capital improvements, they increased approximately 14 million. And the operating capital requirements actually went down about 3 million. So there's a little give and take.
So these are, I mean, because I probably heard this a couple times, but these are the figures that we would choose to accept for this report.
That's correct. These are the figures that Penn 2, SDIC, MCDD, and Penn 1 all accepted during their June 29th format meeting. And now we're offering this same report to the urban district.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Shirley?
A question that I don't think I understand or have or know. So in the memo that you sent, it says here that these assets are being transferred to this new district. It will be our responsibility to get the electors' support to be able to find funding to be able to manage and operate these assets. So so that's out into the future. So what is our immediate responsibility that this board has as when we take over these assets? What are our responsibilities between now and when we approach the voters to get support for the funding? Do we have anything specific that we are responsible for that we don't have responsible for until we vote today? So please describe that dynamic.
I'll take a stab at it and let others jump in to fill in any gaps. My understanding is that the current districts, the 4 district drainage districts and company have the responsibility to maintain the assets until the new urban district is created. And once they are created, then some of these costs are what we're projecting over time. So my understanding is that the urban district does not have any responsibility to maintain any of these assets until that point. And I'll look to others to fill in the gaps or correct that description.
I saw that Kelly Sherbo's on the call. I don't know, Kelly, if you have any other thoughts besides what Bill conveyed.
No, I think that's correct. In my thinking about how the statute is set up, this board wouldn't take any responsibility for assets until that dissolution happens. So I don't see there being any O&M sort of responsibilities in the meantime.
Yeah, it's my understanding, Councilor Craddock, that the intent of this is to provide detailed information with you as you're starting to think, as the new board starts to think about its rate structure and how it wants to fund and create its operational setup. Now you know what you're going to be working with should dissolution occur or when dissolution occurs.
Thank you.
Other questions of Bill? Okay, if there are no other questions, then I guess I'd entertain an motion to accept the report as presented.
So
Can't
moved.
resist taking the moment to just thank Bill and his team. It's a ton of work to pull all that together, and it's quite thorough and really well documented. So thank you, Bill and team, for assembling all this useful information. Really appreciate it. Sorry.
Thank you for that, Jim. And I think Eric moved to, did I get that right, Eric?
Yes, move to accept receipt of the report or acknowledgement of the report, I think is the language.
I'll second.
And I got Steve Fancher to second. Any further questions or discussion other than thanking Bill and his staff and others who worked on this? I know it's been a big lift. If not, Emily, I think you'll need to call the roll on this one.
And I saw Ann Grevitt has logged on since we did the roll call, so she's here. So I'll start with her. Ann Grevitt.
I'm here. Thank you. Yes.
Of course. Lori Stegman.
Aye.
Dave Ritma.
Yes.
Eric Mueller.
Yes.
Shirley Craddock.
Aye.
James Ellison.
Yes.
John Niama.
Yes.
John L. Bell.
Aye.
Mary Helen Kincaid.
Yes.
Michael Jordan.
Yes.
Steve Fancher.
Yes.
And Tanny Stephenson.
Yes.
That's it.
All right. Thank you
Thank
all
you
very
all.
much. And Bill, again, once again, thank you. Great work. Very thorough. Yeah. Yippee. And then I think Evan, you're up for an update on mission, vision, values. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks everybody. So I just wanted to quickly check in with this group. You know, it's been an interesting voyage with the Mission Vision Values Committee as we've changed executive directors and gone through this project. We have recently been talking about this project, and I think the last time I was with you all, I had reported that we've been having a lot of challenges trying to bring the whole group, the whole committee together for the summer. We also heard that staff was really interested in being more involved in the activity. We heard that through the engagement that we did earlier in the year. So we've been talking about it internally, and we are working internally to adapt the process so that staff can play more of a role and that we can bring you more of a draft that you all can comment on. I think we'll also, we'll be able to work faster to do that. It'll still be the fall before we are able to finalize something, but then we'll be able to kind of keep things going and not just stop completely over the summer. I think the way that we're talking about sort of changing the process is staff will work internally, draft something up, we'll bring it to the committee to look at, and then probably do a round of outreach to community benefit organizations, which will give us a chance to not only vet the mission, vision, values with community benefit organizations, but will also give us a chance to start to talk about more meaningful partnerships to do some community engagement in the coming year with Echo Northwest, and give them a chance to provide some feedback on the draft, which is something that we heard pretty loud and clear in the initial round of engagement. Please come to us. Please let us help you with the engagement. So, I just wanted to, I don't have a ton of details yet. We're still working all of that out, but I just wanted to sort of share an update about where we are and let you know we'll be coming back with more information. Happy to answer questions.
Evan, it would be helpful for me at least to get kind of an updated timing and phasing of what you just articulated, but trying to understand kind of the dynamics between the pieces and the phases and who's involved at which phase and how information might flow through the process. That would be helpful for me to be able to see that. And I realize it's dynamic and it's changing, and that's okay. It would be good for me to see that. So
Absolutely.
thank you. Other questions, comments for Evan?
This is Shirley. I guess I wasn't aware that, the struggle has been trying to get everybody together, basically so-called in quotes, one room. I guess I wasn't aware of that. Is it the focus groups, getting these other groups together, working with the community?
No, it's the committee members,
The
just
committee?
getting
Oh.
everybody together. And
Okay.
your staff has been amazing, Councilor Craddock. Unfortunately, not everybody has scheduling staff and that sort of support. So yeah, it's just been really hard to get all the committee members together. And unfortunately, only 2 people were able to meet at all this summer.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I apologize.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a question, because I'm going to quote Phil Ralston on this one. I'm on too many committees. I thought that I was on this one, and I don't recall getting any notice because being retired, my calendar's pretty open. So maybe the day you picked, I wasn't available, but I being on committees, it seems like if you choose to be on a committee and then can't meet any available times, you shouldn't be on the committee. And I'll speak to myself for that. So anyway, I apologize if I answered no to everything, because, okay. Or maybe I was one of the 2.
You were.
Busy people.
Yeah, I mean, we got a lot of really good feedback, and I think we're digesting now. And I actually think we're going to be able to bring you back some additional ideas that'll help you have a thoughtful conversation among yourselves with some additional public input from community members that we think is really important, particularly people who aren't as familiar with the districts and what we do and what the urban district's setting up to do.
And I agree with what Mike said about getting like a timeline so you can kind of know. And when you come up with that process, if it's more than 3 pages, to get it far enough in advance that you have time to digest it before you have to discuss it, because there's some really potentially important things in the mission, vision, values, and especially, in light of current events and flooding and rain and, how people are might shift their views a little bit. So.
Other comments or questions? Evan, can we expect maybe that document before our next meeting so that we can kind of get up to speed on where we are with it? And I guess my only concern, and I understand the challenge and I get it, but my concern is that we have a number of committees that either are or want to start working on other aspects of our work. And the mission, vision, value document is kind of a touch North Star to navigate by. And so I just don't want us to get too far in front of that conversation with anything else. I know the Revenue Development Committee is going to start meeting next month, assuming anybody can actually make that meeting. So anyway, that's my only concern, and I appreciate the challenge, but that's a critical path item of all of our work, I think. So
I think that's why we're trying to find a way to keep it moving forward.
okay, all right. Okay, not seeing any other comments. We'll expect that kind of phasing document coming soon, and we'll talk about this again next month, I am certain. And you've got the next item also then, Evan, the state legislature.
Oh, yeah.
An uplifting topic.
Well, part of it is uplifting. So I'll start with the bad news first and then go to the good news. So we can end on an uplifting note. So couple of asks that we had in front of the legislature this year. As most of you know, the legislature just ended, I guess, a couple weeks ago now. And we had requested $2 million from them to support the urban flood safety water quality districts operations for the next 2 years. The legislature operates in biennia, and that 2 year, their budgets are 2 years. So we asked for basically $1 million a year. Unfortunately, they did not did not feel that that was something that they wanted to fund. We have not gotten a full answer on why. We're still doing some digging. We have our suspicions as to why, but I think as the summer continues on and people return from their sort of post-legislative session vacations, we'll be able to get more, we'll be able to have more conversations with people and get a better understanding of what happened. We're currently planning on going to the emergency board, which typically meets sometime around September, October in the fall to make funding decisions as they kind of see how the budget is how budget spending is going for the year. So we'll definitely make an ask there. And then if that doesn't work out for us, we'll make an ask in the short session in January of 2022. So we'll have a couple more avenues to make asks in the coming year. And we'll obviously continue to factor in what we learn as we talk to people about that. It was a disappointment for sure. The less sad news is that we were able to get, we had received a $500,000 grant in 2019. We were able to get the remainder of that grant carried over. So we have about half of that remaining. And so we will be able to spend that this fiscal year. So that was carried over. We also had a grant that we had a little bit left for Levy Ready Columbia and the Regional Infrastructure Fund. And that was carried over as well. So we'll be able to spend that money. There was also a levy grant fund that was created in Business Oregon in 2019. Levy Ready Columbia helped create a grant fund that had previously received $15 million in bond sales that were allocated that were never actually fulfilled because of the pandemic. And we'd gone back and asked for 10 million because that was what we'd previously asked for. And the legislature saw, I assume because they weren't able to fulfill the original 15, they decided to allocate another 15 in bond sales this year. So in April of 2023, they will let 15 million in bond sales for this levy grant fund, and we'll be eligible for at least 40% to go ask for grants of up to at least 40%, potentially more, depending on how they define some of their rules around the money in that grant fund. So that's really exciting for both us and the state that there's now a real grant fund with money that hopefully isn't disrupted by a pandemic that will be accessible to the state and has a good chunk of money in it that will be available in the spring of 2023. So I think with that, I will ask if there's any questions about the legislative update and leave it there.
Any questions? My only one would be, I'm assuming that our avenue for information is through the speaker's office again. Okay. All right.
One of the main ones.
Okay.
Evan, I have a question. And of course I haven't read the language, but where does the 40% come from? Like, how do we know that it's 40%?
Well, so the way that the levy grant fund was set up was to mirror the special public works fund, which was divided 60-40. And that was really at the request of Senator Betsy Johnson, who, I think to summarize it, doesn't want Portland to get everything. And so made it so rural and economically disadvantaged places in Oregon would get the majority of the funding. And so the levy grant fund is set up in a similar way. And what we're finding is that parts of MCVB should qualify for the 60%. Maybe it's possible that other parts of our districts may also qualify, but we're not 100% sure about that yet.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. Thank you.
Other questions?
I just have to ask, now that the Kenton Firehouse is open, where where Tina's office is, and I go there about every other day pre-pandemic for other stuff, and occasionally bump into her. Can you give me some talking points? So when she says, how are things going? What can I do to help? That I can answer, because I might not say the right things, and I want to be able to answer that. So,
Yeah.
okay. I know that's asking a little extra, and I could probably read through the stuff, but I'm not so inclined to say the right things and the right figures at the right time. So
No,
I
that's
just
great.
like to carry that in my pocket so I can answer her and not look silly.
No, thank you.
So it's a small state, Mary Helen, and it probably wouldn't be a bad idea for all of us to have at least one or two talking points about where the district is and why the financials are important, and just a couple, because lots of people on this call have circles of acquaintances that they run into that it could be helpful to be able to convey the message. So I think that's a great point to bring up. And if all else fails, just say, show me the money. So
What I said the last time was a little more not politically correct as that. I just said, sign us a check and send it to us.
Okay. Well, the same idea gets across. Okay, if there are no other questions about legislative issues, then I'm gonna,
I just want to clarify. So Evan, I think you said you're going to be you're still trying to research why this failed, that you're still trying to get that information. Is that correct? Thank you.
okay. Colin, I think you're up with the revenue development process.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to give a brief update on the revenue development work, the contract with for finance planning and revenue analysis, and then briefly walk through the scope items that we are currently developing with the selected contractor, Echo Northwest. Actually, Emily, could you go to the next slide? So I'm not going to go through every single one of these. I did, since this slide was in the packet. I wanted to sort of give the full laydown of tasks that the contractor will be looking at. But just as a quick reminder, this contract with Echo Northwest, the purpose of it is to actually develop the revenue tools that this new district will be employing to make a recommended finance plan, revenue plan to implement. And so this is a 2-year, $250,000 contract. This is one of those lists of committees that will require a good bit of board participation, but we can also look for other ways to speed it up through some experts, as well as we have a really great group of staff that will be helping move this through. So what I wanted to do, and I guess just as an update, so we did select Echo Northwest. They still aren't under contract. We are in a very positive way going back and forth on finalizing the scope. So that's why I did not share the finalized scope with you, because that is to be developed. We should have that within the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be able to share that with the board when it's finalized. And then we'll also be having a kickoff. In a couple slides, I'll review some of the upcoming things that we'll be discussing. But during that kickoff, we'll actually be refining and finalizing the work plan, especially participation of a board committee. But I did want to spend a little bit of time going through some of the steps that Echo Northwest, as well as this board, will be taking to get to a recommended revenue plan, and especially some of the bigger things. So this project is split into 2 phases. The first phase is really focused on major research and analytical tasks that will identify and characterize revenue options. And fundamentally, it is also to develop the actual model that will be used. That model will be refined throughout the 2-year project, but we really want to get that put down and have the structure reviewed and finalized, or not finalized, but have it reviewed and operational as soon as possible. So some of the big tasks that are really important for setting the foundation of this work include working out the communications and engagement plan. As has been discussed with this board, this is really a key opportunity for this board to really engage with community members that are directly affected by this work, but also the broader community that might not be aware of the work that this board will be responsible. There's a much larger geography. All of Multnomah County within the urban growth boundary. And so we're gonna really need to be able to reach out to different parts of the community to really help support the project, but also to use it as an opportunity to educate and bring in new ideas. So a couple of the early tasks really are to set out a communications and engagement plan. And so the initial plan is to be done the middle of September, but that will be refined throughout. We also have scoped in a lot of sort of iterative processes so that we're not just locked into anything. And I'll touch on a couple of those during the second phase, so you can see how we'll revisit some of these things to make sure the project is moving forward as designed. So some of the bigger tasks that we haven't done in the past include task 1.4, which is the characterization of the district activities, costs, and priorities. Really, to boil this task down is to look at what funding is needed and how much funding that revenue option will need to generate. And so this will incorporate some of the work that we already have, so activities and costs that are already known and well-defined. But it will also need to identify some of the activity and costs that are generally known but might not be well-defined, or even ones that, so an example of that would be taking a look at how we could actually update our existing capital plans at the drainage districts to incorporate more environmentally friendly alternatives. And then we'll also need a third set, which are activities and costs that are unknown or new and will be needed to be addressed through estimates from existing data sources, as well as expert input, partially from members of this board. So an example of that would be any of the statutory missions requirements around embedding equity into the work, about new capital plans that might be environmental plans, anything restoration related, or even some of the green infrastructure work that just hasn't been identified yet. Another major task is identifying and characterizing the revenue options 1.6. And so this is really important because this is the task where they'll actually be looking at the full breadth of tools that are available to this new district. We currently at the drainage districts utilize mostly assessments. We do not have the ability to have some of the other tools available, such as local improvement districts, system development charges, general obligation bonds, or utility rates. And so this is to look at all the revenue sources available to the district, and we'll also review existing revenue structures that are employed both in Oregon, but also beyond. There's a number of districts that we're aware of around the country that have recently switched their revenue sources. And so this will also be a survey of some of those best practices, and will include interviews. And then, of course, a very key part of this is actually developing the revenue model. This is required to be a user accessible model, and it'll have something on the front end that'll probably be web-based so that we'll actually be able to quote unquote move the levers. We have not finalized exactly what the back end will be, but we assume that it will be Excel-based, and that is for sort of the durability of the product, and so that we'll be able to continue developing it even after this contract is done, so that it'll be easily updatable. And then one other piece that I think is really important in this phase to touch on is this equity analysis of the revenue options. And so the equity analysis will be taking a look really focused on some of the levels of service, demographic and historical information about those that will actually be impacted by whatever these recommended revenue tools are. And so that will be using Echo Northwest equity lens, and we'll apply it directly to this project. So that is really an affordability analysis. Can you go to the next slide, please, Emily? Actually, I'll stop there. Are there any questions about this first phase? James.
James.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. Great walking through the different steps. I'm wondering, and maybe it's not something that needs to be answered now, but I'm wondering where, you touched on this, but where we look at what the enabling legislation is. And I like your idea of a spreadsheet, but you go from enabling legislation, other drivers, services, what services are we providing and not providing, the levels of those services, and then potential partner agencies, since we exist within a framework of many other agencies. Will we get that level of detail in the revenue development, or is that kind of something that needs to happen down the road as the organization takes shape?
No, I think if I understand your question correctly, that will be analyzed. And actually, Emily, could you roll back up to that first slide, please? And I believe that, so I think, so it's pretty sequential how Echo Northwest is approaching this. So it is characterizing, some of these things will be done at the same time, but characterizing sort of the sort of world of need as far as our existing costs. That includes some of the work or all of the work that Bill and his team worked on around debt obligations, the assets and liabilities, and then really finding those holes where we don't have appropriate numbers or even estimates, and coming up with some expert recommendations. And even if that is sort of a high, medium, and low, or sort of percentage of our existing capital plan, really finding those best practices to employ it. And I think what I skipped, and I know I skipped this, was that task 1.5. And I think that's where we get in, because I touched on 1.6, which is taking a look at all of the available revenue tools that are available. But that task 1.6 is really taking the mission, vision, values work basically as sort of that foundation, combining it with what's done in that task 1.4 and sort of the world of need, and then being able to identify the benefits that will be provided by any of those investments. So that's it's largely a spatial analysis that they're going to be doing through GIS, taking a look at different benefit categories in these. What we used when we did the first round was of typologies. So you have a single family residential house, you have a small business, a large lot, and a public park and a vacant lot, and start applying sort of what available revenue tools are to those different kinds of typologies. So I don't know if I exactly hit where you're asking, but I think it is pretty sequential of doing, what tools are there, what costs are needed, and then what benefits are received by using those different tools.
Shirley? You're on mute, Shirley.
Thank you. Sorry.
It's okay.
So at the end of all of this, this group, this organization will have to approach the voters to get their support. Are there plans that as you move through these different steps that there will be outreach to focus groups, to organizations, to communities to test these models to make sure that we think there's some notion of going to be support for this at the when people vote, because it doesn't matter what revenue model we come up with, if we can't get the voters' support, this will not be successful. So I assume that has to be a big part of this is evaluating how these the different revenue models and how they sit with the public and their possible support of voting to make, be able to take action on this.
Yes, that's a great point. And so implementing the communications engagement plan is done throughout each one of the tasks or the subtasks, and is revisited both with, where appropriate, with some of the stakeholders that participated, as well as with board members and with staff. So yes, it is done iteratively. Thank you.
I'll just throw out, if I could throw out one other comment, just to ponder this, but something to think about is, I don't know if we can get the support of the media, but do some, what is you get their support on the radio to make mention of what this organization does, begin to talk about the levy system, the value of levies, history of levies, just to bring the public forward and with us to even know that they exist and the value they bring to the larger community. So I'm sorry, I guess I'm looking for PSA. Is that the public announcement? I don't know if you'll consider any kind of or any kind of media that we might be able to get their support. I know that's a big stretch, but it seemed like there would be out front, we should be bringing attention to this levy system and the value it brings to the greater region and the history it's had and and then also the what happened when the levee breached and we don't want to ever have that happen again. So I just throw that out and plant that seed and have you think about that. But I would think that we really could be of great value to getting the voters to support this if there was some information moving out ahead of approaching them to ask for their financial support.
Yes, absolutely, Councilor Craddock. And I think you have said that in the past, and we've definitely taken it to heart in our planning. And so it's definitely, it's part of both this project, but more importantly, a larger communications plan to sort of build identity, to build trust, but also to really focus, engage on some of the communities within the region that haven't participated, that don't know about this, or have been disenfranchised in the past. If we have a little bit of time, I might just kick it to Evan to add anything additional. I think I saw her hand up.
I guess there's a couple things just to tack on. So I imagine it'll be kind of messy as we go forward to kind of separate revenue development project and communications. There will be some specific stuff from a contracting basis that will only be in the Echo Northwest contract but overall, we're thinking about sort of a bigger communications and engagement plan. And one of the first things that we're trying to get off the ground is some polling to do as soon as possible, basically based on our procurement capacity. So I've been, trying to move polling forward basically since I started a couple years ago, because I think we need to have a better understanding of what people care about. and how we talk about the levies to them. And then we need to push as many stories, as many PSAs, as many, get as many people out walking on the levies and vote towards with reporters and as many things as we can come up with to build visibility and build sort of this culture of awareness around having, especially with the things that are going on right now and the extreme weather. And there's going to sadly be continued opportunity to talk about what we have going on. Meanwhile, we'll also have these opportunities to talk about the new district and the revenue structure, which will be going on sort of side by side with this project. And we'll need to continue to keep moving both of those forward. And so, yes, absolutely, Councilor Craddock. And if you have ideas and if you want to do stuff with us, we would love to take any opportunity to talk about the levies and build public awareness, especially outside of the managed floodplain, because people who get their boxes delivered by Amazon need to understand where those boxes are being delivered from, or who use the airport, or who like to go check out their RVs at the expo center. We have lots of opportunity to kind of build the connection, but we absolutely have to do it. But we'll be sort of navigating those two things side by side.
Thank you.
Oh, Nick, do you want to add anything?
Yes, sir. Just one quick clarification, and not to derail it now, Councilor Craddock, but to see if we're all on the same page. The way I was reading ORS 550, just to make sure, we have many revenue sources we might decide to look at. And when and if we turn to GO bonds, it specifically says we need voter approval. But to clarify, when we look at the other things, assessments, service and user charges, and revenue bonds, those would be done basically with this board's approval. We wouldn't go back and ask the public if and until we do a general obligation bond. I just wanted to clarify that kind of big point.
Thank you, Nick. Having been through this conversation a couple of different times, the board also needs to understand that the adoption of a utility is a referable decision, and it could be referred by petition to the people for a vote. So you're absolutely right. However, I think the board, to Shirley's point, is going to have to do huge amounts of outreach and engagement so people understand that if this board does take an action to form a utility, they've done it with lots of engagement and lots of discussion among the public. So good points all the way around. Thank you.
I resist being a communications guy, that we really appreciate you bringing this up, and we're working really hard to bring you what I think is a realistic but also assertive communications and engagement program. And we're working on procurement and some very specific equity related actions. And I just appreciate your consistency and wanting to do a good job making sure people know what we're doing, and we take it real seriously. So thank you again for bringing it up.
Can I just, I've also echoed what Commissioner Craddock has said from the very beginning, because I have neighbors that live a half a mile from the levee and don't know it's a levee. And I have people that live in Alameda that say, what levee? So there's a real importance there. So I just want to emphasize how important that is, to start with the people that are going to vote. And then, no offense to any of the people, but the neighbors are going to pretty much stay in place. But politicians, people in jobs, they're going to change. So we need to be able to make it a communications plan that's doable by whoever comes after. And Evan and I have had this conversation, and I think we have a great understanding, and she has a great plan, because I think that they're doing a great job, a difficult job. And I only have a reference back to when the Airport Futures and Bill Furman sat in a room and said something about, well, when we build the third runway, and all hell broke loose. So I want to make sure that we have the ability to know what to say, but also what would be harmful to the effort to the neighbors to hear. Not that they don't need to hear it, but inflammatory things that we could say that don't seem inflammatory to us. And I think that's going to be a big piece of it when we all go out there.
Absolutely, Mary Helen. Colin, you've got about 9 minutes left. I didn't know how much more you had to present.
I think I have about 5 minutes of presentation left, and I will try to hustle right through that. Can I, Emily, you go one slide above that, please? Above that or before that. Thank you. So quickly, I just want to touch on the second phase of this project, which is really shifting from sort of a lot of the work is front loaded of really just trying to define what we're doing. The second phase is largely focused on evaluation and refinement. So it's the development of recommendations and ultimately developing and hopefully adopting a formal revenue plan. So just a couple of things that are important in this, and we've reserved scope and budget for it, is at the beginning of this phase is to sort of open back up our communications and engagement plan, as well as the overall project management structure, and making sure that everything still makes sense. And so we'll actually rework and confirm that the work plan is still appropriate for what we need. We imagine that a lot will change during that first year. So we want to make sure that there's some flexibility for that. The development of recommended revenue structures, or the options, is really key. And that is actually going to take a lot of iterative work, both in the community as well as with some specific external and internal stakeholders that will help develop this. Just to quickly go through, I think this is ultimately about getting to that final revenue plan. So I won't belabor this part of the work, but just a flag for you all is that the second year of this, while it'll be less kind of production, it's going to be a lot more revision, and I think it will actually be one of the hardest parts of this work. Are there any questions about the second phase and the goals of that? All right, hustling right through. Emily, go to the next slide, please. So what's coming up soon? Soon we will have a final contract in hand. There are a few administrative things that we'll need to do. We will have a formal resolution in front of this board in August to create the committee. We will also have a kickoff with MCDV staff and Echo Northwest soon after that committee, or soon after that committee structure is approved. And then you'll have a formal charter that is largely going to be informed by the finalized work plan that will come to you in September. Just a note on this work, I am actually going to begin a parental leave, and I am very grateful for Nick Hogan, our CFO, stepping in to work as project manager on this, as well as Evan and so many other staff that are going to be helping move this forward while I'm out of the office. And then a huge part of this work is going to be the membership of this board. And I know that we've talked a little bit about limited capacity, so I think we'll need to discuss if there's ways to have some kind of additional expert advice on this. But currently we have the members of the board that are listed there that you all identified yourself as being interested in participating in this board. You don't have to say it now, but if you would either like to drop off of this committee, or if you would like to join the committee and you don't see your name on there, please reach out to Kirsten and she will either add you or drop you from this list. And with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
I just want to make sure whether you're on this committee or not, you're implicated, and we're going to work with you and get your help for getting this right. So you can't escape.
Unindicted co-conspirators.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Colin. Appreciate it. I don't see any right now. And I want to make sure, because when I saw this on the agenda, I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time. Carrie Sandman is up with this presentation on the history of Indigenous people in the managed floodplain. Carrie?
Yes, thank you. And to be very clear, I will not be giving the presentation, but I will be providing an introduction and a little bit of context for Dr. David Lewis, who is here, second time's the charm, to present to us about some research that he has been doing on behalf of MCDD. So I'll have just a couple minutes and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Lewis. So I want to, first recognize that it is one of the purposes of the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District to provide the public with information regarding the cultural history of the territory in the managed floodplain that's in sub 170. And this is something that MCDD staff, much credit to Karen Carrillo, who has since left the agency, but been interested in for a number of years, and ultimately engaged Dr. Lewis to do some of the research that you will hear about today. And our staff have been thinking and hope that ultimately you all are thinking about some of the opportunities that come from having a deeper understanding about the cultural history of the managed floodplain. And here are just a few of those ideas, which I won't read through directly, but really relative to deeper understanding of the natural landscape and Indigenous communities in the floodplain, opportunities that relate to having a partnership, element of trust, relationship with tribes and Indigenous peoples that are part of our community today. And so Dr. Lewis is going to talk about the historical presence, life, and cultural practices of Native people here in the 1800s and prior. Now, I want to recognize that Indigenous peoples have been part of this landscape since time immemorial. They are our original land managers and caretakers of the slough and the floodplain for millennia, and that Indigenous peoples and tribes have persisted in this watershed and continue to live and thrive here today. Despite colonial violence and injustice and inequity, there are many individuals, communities, tribal members who live and operate in our managed floodplain, for instance, the NEA campus. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Well, I suppose that didn't stop. Stop sharing my screen and welcome Dr. Lewis, who is a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, a descendant of Takelma, Chinook, Molalla, and Santiam Kalapuya peoples of Western Oregon. His research focuses on the tribal histories of Northwest coastal people, specializing in Western Oregon tribes. He teaches at Oregon State and holds masters and PhDs in anthropology from the University of Oregon. Dr. Lewis.
Thanks, Carrie.
Take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So from what I understand, you want a presentation on Native peoples, and so I have that for you. It was developed.
Welcome, Dr. Lewis, if I may. Welcome, first of all, and I just wanted to ask, because I have a feeling there may be questions. Do you want everybody to kind of wait till the end, or would you? How do you want to handle that?
Yeah, that would be best for me to get through it, and then I can go back to slides if I need to. But
perfect.
Yeah, it would be best if I go through. Otherwise, if I interrupt my thought process, I may forget a few things.
No problem.
Because as you know, old people forget things. So.
Well, wait a minute. As I know.
I'm including myself there, so I'm.
There you go. I get it.
So, okay. So thank you for Carrie and everybody that arranged for this. This presentation was pretty much developed at the end of the research project I did, which I ended sometime in April of this year. This presentation happened in March, so I added a few things that I've come to understand recently, but it's pretty much the same as it was in March. So let me go through it here for you. Unfortunately, you haven't had the opportunity to read through the report yet, so maybe at some point soon you'll have that opportunity, and that way you'll be a little more informed about what we're talking about today. But let me get this started, and let me see if I can. Yeah, I think that's it. Are we good?
Not yet.
Oh, wait a minute. I have to, sorry, I did it the wrong way. Forgot. Okay, got share screen and then do it. Okay. It's been a couple weeks for it. So
Okay. There you go.
all right, there we go. All right, great. You should be able to see that now.
Can.
This is our initial landing screen, and again, save your questions to the end, and I'll get through this. All right, how long do I have? About 20 minutes or so?
Depending on, yeah, we've actually got about 45 or 50. 40.
Okay, I don't have to rush then.
Yep.
Great, perfect. Okay, so here's an introduction to the Chinooks. So in our area of the Columbia River, in your area of the 4 groups, and now going to be one group, one organization. The people were Chinookan peoples, and there were a good number of different Chinookan tribes. Each of these little areas was, most of them were Chinookan tribes. So there's one Clatskanie tribe, Tualatin, a few Tillamook's in here, but most of those areas were Chinookan tribes that went all the way up the coast of Washington and all the way inland to right around the Dalles, just above the Dalles. So there's a lot of different tribes in here, something like a dozen or more tribes with large areas. And let's see. So let's see. Where am I at? Okay. So part of our area here, this Portland Basin, what we call it today, I'm calling in this presentation the Wapato Basin or Wapato Valley, because that's where a lot of anthropologists have begun calling it, because there was so much Wapato here. So, and I think you'll see that as part of the presentation. So, first thing to know, historically, that made massive changes to the peoples is this disease factor. In the 1830s, there was a massive disease, probably malaria, that came through and wiped out something like 85 to 97% of the tribal peoples, including the Chinookans and Kalapuians, who were some of the primary peoples in our area. And people, the survivors of this pandemic, really, had to move to smaller and smaller villages. And so where there had been perhaps 10 villages, there were 1. And you'll see that kind of, I'll show you on the Lewis and Clark maps, you know, what the number of villages in the area, and just think about that being reduced down just to a couple. But after that initial death of about 5 years, we see a lot of different other peoples coming into the area. Klickitat, Cowlitz peoples were coming in and either crossing or occupying different villages that were abandoned. And we also see this is a prime opportunity for settlers to come in. And so this is directly following the 1830s, was, you know, the Oregon Trail began in 1844. And it sort of in a big way, thousands of Americans came over the Oregon Trail and settled in the Willamette Valley, really kind of taking advantage of these tribes that had somewhat died off by this pandemic, that were of the sort of new exposure of diseases, what they call virgin soil exposures. So at that time, this area looked like it was a park-like structure, kind of waiting for people to occupy it. And many folks thought that maybe it had been abandoned by Native people. And the people that the settlers and the explorers and fur traders that came after the pandemic, they didn't see a time when there was many villages were tens of thousands of people here. So what they saw was a much reduced population, and so the Native people didn't seem like they were that big of a deal. And so that's part of our history, part of the reasons why certain decisions are made, sort of ignore Native peoples, ignore their previous land claims, because they didn't present a large population enough to sort of worry about by settlers. And that's kind of the story that begins the changes in the area. So, and here's those middle Chinookans in our area. We see the crossover. We see, in my studies, I found that there were lots of different peoples living in this Wapato Valley, that there were Cascades people that came in the wintertime and occupied areas of the south part of the river. There were Clackamas people that already were living in this area, Clackamas and Kaliwala, that were already living on the Willamette and on the Columbia, that were previous, that there was their homeland. There were what we call Multnomah or Wapato Island peoples that were living along, Salvia Island and on north and south side of the river. And so there were a lot of different peoples in this area already, and they all sort of coexisted in peace. There was no warfare, there was no lines on the ground, there was no territorial acknowledgement. There was no need for this because there was enough resources in the landscape, enough fish, enough plants, enough hunting, that nobody really had to want for anything. There was no territorial battling over territory or anything. And so many people in this period, even before colonization and stuff, were still, they always utilized all the resources in the area. People that lived on the riverbank didn't only fish, they also went into the interior. They would hunt and gather plants for making baskets and things. And this was kind of a seasonal lifestyle. We'll see the seasonal round in a few minutes, where they would sort of move into this area in different seasons when things are ready, or when they had to sort of escape from the cold weather. They'd move into this valley away from the gorge and live here for several months, and then move back into the gorge when it came time for fish runs. And so this was a pretty significant part of this culture. So that's and so they had all kinds of cultural things happening in the area. They had berry harvests in the summertime. There was intertribal marriage, so there wasn't there was distinct tribes that were controlled by chiefs or headmen, but a lot of times they're all intermarried. So one of the things I've noticed about this whole area is there wasn't a lot of war. There wasn't a lot of warfare between peoples that were related to the Chinookan peoples. So, and that's because it was constantly people intermarrying between the tribes, between the tribal, the leaders in the tribes. And this kept everybody kind of trading with each other, friendly with each other, and kept everybody kind of wealthy in the area. And it sort of allowed for peace to prosper in the area too, because you're not going to necessarily make war on your cousins or your direct relatives. So, the Cascades were directly related to the Clackamas and the Multnomah. There was a constant intermarriage. There never was necessarily a distinct tribe, except for under certain tribal leaders in certain areas. There were lots of gatherings at different times of the year, like trade gatherings. People get together and trade for fish. In certain areas where there was lots of resources, like Willamette Falls or the Cascade Rapids, there was lots of fishing happening. And so those tribes that occupied those areas in the seasons would catch a lot of salmon, and they would process that, like dry it or smoke it. And so that dried or smoked salmon would be then traded with other tribes, because they would have basically plentiful amounts of it for trade. Other tribes would come with Wapato or Camas or elk products or canoes or whatever they made, and they could trade for salmon food. So that was kind of the way things worked. And if you've read at all like the Lewis and Clark journals, and I encourage you to do so, you can see that everything was a very multicultural society. People were all traveling up and down the river, trading with each other. They knew where their home villages were. They knew that they were sort of related to certain tribes, that they had a home village, but they always were moving up and down the river, trading with people, visiting relatives, fishing when they could, gathering other foods when they could, all the time. So this is pretty significant to think about. Here's a kind of a representation of that on our what we call a seasonal round representation. We see this winter village idea. This would be the Wapato Valley for the Cascades. They had hunting camps at certain times of the year. They would have a spring salmon. So after their winter village in early May, they would return back to the Cascades and set up their village again, and begin fishing for salmon. And I'm talking about moving the whole village, all the boards and everything down from one place to another place in canoes. Later in the summertime, they would have camas root camps. And if people were more on the river fishing and stuff, then other peoples would go inland and get camas, or they would trade at other tribes that had camas, had more camas, like the Calapuyans. Calapuyans had tons of camas. We have a materials camp where they would go get bark, like cedar bark, or juncus or tule or something to make various products out of. They have later in the summertime, they would have huckleberry camps where people from the Columbia would even go up into the high Cascades and pick huckleberries. There would be trade gatherings after times of plenty. So when everybody would get thousands of salmon, dry them out, smoke them out, then there would be a time when tribes would come to your camp and then trade for those things. Later in the summer would be acorn camps where, Oak Savannah would produce acorns and people would sort of gather those things up. There was a pretty noted process for doing that at Wapato Island. Actually, they have there was actually found archaeologically the native people had utilized the tidal action that comes in from the Pacific to wash small indentations in the land alongside the shore that were full of sort of these nets full of acorns, and they would wash out the acorns, wash out the tannins out of the acorns with the wave action over a period of probably several weeks, and it would be a sort of safe way to sort of clean their acorns for eating. There'd be another materials camp at the end of the summer where they'd also maybe be picking blackberries and other berries. Fall salmon camp would happen. There were likely 4 or 5, for some tribes, 5 or more salmon camps throughout the year. Some tribes would set prairie fires, like the Calapuyans would set fires to prairies, which would help them have more food the next season. So things like tarweed and camas and other plants would prosper after this period, these fall prairie fires. There would be hazelnut camps where people would gather nuts into the summer. Also things like apples, crab apples, they were also gathered. And then later on, hunting camps again. And so this was the sort of annual cycle of activities the tribes would do and move to different encampments to take advantage of different resources on the land. Here's some 19th century images, drawings and woodcuts of tribal people doing these cultural things. We see up here tribes using nets, like probably gill nets, on the shore of the Columbia to draw in salmon using their gill nets, maybe using canoes as well. Up here we see in the circle Willamette Falls in the background, and women, what appears to be drying something right here, perhaps salmon. It was pretty common to have sort of drying racks next to villages in this area. Here we see the sort of model plank house with the Chinook style canoes drawn up on shore, which is very common in this area. And then we have Willamette Falls here where Indians are gathering salmon using these sort of dip nets, and these like Grand Ronde does today, where they're now practicing again using dip nets at the Willamette Falls. And we see them sort of dressed in these sort of European clothing, because in the time that this image was drawn, was seen, 1841, there was actually quite a bit of European products in the area from the fur traders from Fort Vancouver. So people were buying fabrics and clothing using probably salmon and stuff. So but the major harvest we had in the area, which reason I believe is the reason why people moved into the area for the Cascades, was the Wapato harvest. The Wapato bulbs grew for whatever reason. We have the best soils, we have the best environment. Oops, for the Wapato. So went one too far. I think this is a very big image. So mouse, where's the mouse? There it goes. Okay, so so we see this is actually called Wapato Harvesters. It was drawn by Gibbs, and it shows a canoe, people drawn up on shore, probably harvesting Wapato alongside the shoreline, and the canoe has a sail in it, which is actually something the tribes had. They had sail technology, but people would go into these sloughs, into marshes and swamps, and gather lots of Wapato. There was lots of Wapato in this area. And if you look at other areas on the Columbia, there didn't seem to be as much Wapato, past perhaps the Cowlitz River on the lower Columbia or up into the gorge area. There wasn't any Wapato. Today, I know that there's a project by the Umatillas to grow Wapato in their area of the Columbia, but I don't know how successful it's going right now. They apparently don't have the as good as soils as we have, or the weather that we have, or the rainfall we have to keep it going. So, but there was lots and lots of Wapato in the areas, and other things would be gathered as well. Junkus, cattail, tule, all the sort of freshwater fishes would be gathered. And there are accounts also in Lewis and Clark texts of lots of sturgeon in the area. And so it almost looks like that sturgeon enjoyed the same environment as the Wapato did. So, which suggests maybe they were somehow working together, living in the same area. They're cohabitating. Here's some maps I put together. This one is, the base is a Lewis and Clark drawn map, or several of them. And these stars represent village locations that the tribes had up and down the river here. These villages in this area, this near Chiquique and near Chacoli, were winter seasonal encampments for the tribe, winter villages for the tribes. These are the places in our project area that these two places, and there were some other areas that had like individual plank houses as well, where people would sort of live in the wintertime. And from there, they would branch out to gathering Wapato, fishing for sturgeon, and even visiting places like the Sandy River and the Cowlitz River for smelt, because they're known to be smelt rivers and stuff. So these were, this village here near Nechicoli was near Blue Lake. We see a little teeny drawing of Blue Lake right here. And it was a pretty major, these people somewhat disappeared, so we don't really know what happened to them. They may have integrated with other populations, like we talked about during disease, or we just don't know. So, but these are all sort of village locations of the tribes up and down the river. There's a lot of them. I think the next slide will take a minute because it's a big one again. There it goes. Okay, so now we call this the Wapato Valley because it's all, it's full of Wapato. So these are all pretty major Wapato gathering locations. See, where places would be like a little swamp or marsh on the islands, in between the islands, on the sides of the islands, on the sides of the shore. In the Willamette Slough right here was well known to have lots of Wapato. Also, all the marshes and lakes on Salisbury Island was known to have lots of Wapato. So this is all prime Wapato growing area down into the Willamette Valley, including Wapato Lake in the Willamette Valley and the Tualatin Valley, which was a huge Wapato growing area. So for whatever reason, probably the climate, probably the soils, there was lots and lots of Wapato here that people accessed all the time. And we then have these two major winter villages of these two tribes that would come in here, and they would access as Wapato. In fact, Lewis and Clark noted that near Chicoli, that there was lots and lots of small canoes up on shore, so canoes much smaller than normal, and they hazarded a guess that they were used for collecting Wapato, because it was the practice of Native women to go into these Wapato beds, Wapato fields, and pry up Wapato from the bottom of the river or the swamp or the marsh or whatever it is, either with their toes or with a lever. The Wapato would float to the top, and then they would throw them in the canoes. So the canoes are actually used for harvesting Wapato. Okay, so, and here's a much more detailed look at one village. This is Blue Lake right here, back in, I don't know, early 20th century or so. Here's where that village would have been right here, this red dot. And here's what they would have had. All these areas would be perhaps suspect for having Wapato or other products they could gather. So there was lots of food in the area, whole bunches of food, which is why many people elected just to stay in the valley too. Some people stayed at these villages year round because there was so much wealth, what we call wealth or food in the area, that they didn't have to leave. There was everything they needed was right here. And here's a image from the Lewis and Clark text of what those small canoes look like. So they actually did a drawing of them. So, so the major theme then is that this area was a major Wapato producing area. That tribes moved into this area of the Willamette, not because there were fishing falls, because there weren't. Not in the, I'm sorry, the Columbia. There wasn't a fishing fall right here. They could do some fishing from the bank. They could line fish if they wanted to. They could spearfish. They had to go other places like Cascade Locks, or what's called Cascade Locks now, but Cascade Rapids or Willamette Falls for doing fishing out of falls. So fishing was not the major activity here. It was actually going and gathering Wapato, because it was a very nutritious food. It was very well liked. Some people, some settlers who came here actually ate it quite a bit. They called it Indian potato. So it was kind of a replacement for regular potatoes before they can grow them. And so the Cascades wintered over for some 6 months or more in what we call the Wapato Valley, and took advantage of all these winter foods all the time. And in the meantime, they also would you know, hunt for sturgeon, fish for sturgeon. I guess it's more hunting because it's a giant fish. And Ooligan, they would get the smelt Ooligan around February, when those Ooligans came and spawned in the Columbia, actually into the tributaries of the Columbia at the Sandy and the Cowlitz River, where the sandy soils were nice for the Ooligans smelts. There wasn't, for what we understand, there was not actually a tribe living up the Sandy River. At that time, it was called the Quicksand River, but there was still a pretty good run of Ooligan there, and there's still a run today. You can actually go there in the right season and catch Ooligan in that river. And here's some of the pictures. We have our sturgeon, the smelt, and then Wapato. These really nutritious bulbs. I don't know if you know, the Wapato is a member of the arrowroot family. There's a bunch of arrowroot, thousands used around the world by different peoples. I think was it jicama is an arrowroot. Poi is made out of arrowroot. So the Hawaiian poi. Sorry, the Chinese actually have arrowroot plants that they access in China, and so when the early Chinese laborers came into this area, they accessed the Wapato as kind of a native food here. So it's and actually I did find some not too long ago in a Asian market here I live in Salem, so in Salem you can actually buy Wapato in the store in little packages in the produce section. So it was pretty amazing to sort of find it there. But they still access that as a food source. That's the only place I found it for sale anywhere. Native people don't sell it. And here's their leaves. They're called arrowroot, I think, because of the leaves are literally an arrow. So the recap is, what I've just been saying. The movement was into this area in basically October. Moving back to the Cascades in probably around May. Some movement of those families also went from the Cascades back to the Willamette Falls in May as well. There were some people that had kinship relationships, probably family of people at the Willamette Falls, and so they would go. They had rights to go fish there at the falls. So Wapito was a major activity. The whole area was part of the ceded lands of the Willamette Valley, ceded lands of the tribes that were in the Willamette Valley Treaty that was ratified March 1855. So this area of this on the south side of the Columbia is part of that treaty. Recently, this is new information. I found treaty pages during some research on my own. And one of the pages added the Klatskanai and a band of the Chinookan peoples called the Nepechek to the treaty. These are treaty pages that hadn't been seen before by anybody, hadn't been identified as being part of the Willamette Valley Treaty. And so we are in the midst of, at Grand Ronde, adding these tribes into the tribal database. And I'm actually working on a project with the Smithsonian and the National Archives to add the treaty pages, the original treaty pages, back into the original treaty so that we have them complete again. So these people were also in this area as well. Incidentally, the treaties that for the Western Oregon are the Cow Creek Umpqua Treaty of 1853, the Rogue River Treaty of 1853, and the other Rogue River Treaty of 1854, the Umpqua and Kalapuya Treaty of 1854, the Shasta Costa Treaty of 1854, and what we call the Kalapuya, etc., or the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, which includes the area of the Columbia. And the last treaty for that whole era was the Molalla Treaty of 1855. So these treaties are all claimed by the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde. All of the people that came to Grand Ronde came from the area of the Willamette Valley Treaty and these treaties as well. So and some of the tribes parties to the Willamette Valley Treaty only came to Grand Ronde. They didn't go to any other reservation, even though they're claimed today by other tribes. Sometimes we've documented pretty well that all the tribes from this area went to Grand Ronde. So treaties began this process of selling off the land to the tribes. They were promised money, supplies, services, and sort of safety from any further conflicts with the settlers. The natives were moved to the Grand Ronde, were given the least desirable lands, and they suffered for it for some 25 to 30 years of having bad agriculture and sort of living in poverty. So the tribes are first moved to temporary reservations, and there is the hint of at least one temporary reservation within the area of our study. I have not found a record of it yet, but it was apparently where the Portland airport was. There was apparently a temporary reservation there, but I haven't found any further record of that yet. In all, in 1856, 4,000 Native people were moved from Western Oregon to two reservations, the Grand Ronde and Siletz. The first removal was the Umpqua and Kalapuyans from the Umpqua Valley, who arrived in February 1856. The second big removal, was the one from Table Rock, who arrived in March 1856. The people that moved onto the Coast Reservation were mainly Rogue River peoples and peoples from the coastal regions. Most of them arrived in the summer of 1856. Grand Ronde originally was supposed to be a temporary reservation, but was made permanent because they put a lot of time and money into it. And the government also wanted to separate two different populations of Native peoples. And the way they made a division was through whether or not they had gone to war against the United States. And so those that had supposedly breached their treaties and gone to war were sent to the Coast Reservation, whereas the people who had not remained at Grand Ronde. And that's from what we understand, is why that division was made and why Grand Ronde was kept, because they wanted to keep the peaceful populations separate from the what they call the warlike populations. There were continual removals throughout the summer. I've even found records of removals of peoples in February, in November of 1856. And then each year there'd be more removals where some tribes would sort of hang out and try to sort of hide out from settlers living in the hills or mountains away from the settlements, and they would be found out and would be reported back to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon, and usually somebody would be sent to sort of gather them up and bring them to the reservation. The last removals that I could find for Western Oregon was in late 1872. Joel Palmer, on one of his final assignments, actually went down south along the coast and gathered people and brought them back to, or for the first time perhaps, to the Coast Reservation. So there were a number of people still living off reservation, even in the early era, that refused to remove because they didn't want to be treated poorly at the reservations. In addition, there was lots of rumors that was sort of put out by the settlers that they were going to be killed if they go onto the reservation. So people avoided that as much as they could. Here's the first map of the reservation. This is drawn in 1856. This is actually a part of, just only a piece of the reservation. The Center Valley was set out for the Calapuyans, who eventually this became permanent for them. We believe that's exactly where also the Chinookan peoples ended up, because they also remained at Grand Ronde. The other peoples, like the Rivers and Umpquas, they were placed down here south of the South Yamhill River, and they were eventually removed out to the coastal reservations. Many of them were. Some of them remained at Grand Ronde. The Malalas were over here. The Tualatans were up here. So these people all remained at Grand Ronde. So Grand Ronde eventually had a population of some 1,200 people, whereas the coastal reservation ended up with a population of some 2,000 to 2,500 people. So eventually, we've been saying at Grand Ronde, because actually, as we've developed more research and begin learning more about the history, we've had to change our story. And when I first got to Grand Ronde and became the cultural director there, the story was we had 5 tribes that came to Grand Ronde. When I added what I knew about the treaties and for my dissertation and everything else, we began saying 27 to 35 tribes. Now that I found 2 new treaty pages that are signature pages for the Royal Valley Treaty, that adds 5 more tribes. So now we have to say 32 to 48 tribes removed to Grand Ronde. This is because, most tribes, again, had gone through disease, were generally small populations of peoples. There were the remnants of other smaller tribes, and the government decided not to give every single tribe a reservation. Rather than that, they grouped them onto larger reservations. And so Grand Ronde and Siletz had this structure. Siletz, which was originally the Coast Reservation, had at least 25 tribes. Grand Ronde had at least from 32 to 48 tribes because of these sort of remnant populations of peoples. There were a lot of changes, which kind of adds to our discussion about, about the subject area, the area of the watershed. The land was never really pristine. There's been lots of talk by settlers and others that, originally they moved to a pristine landscape, and that was never the case. The tribes always had some management of it, either by setting fires or harvesting foods or choosing certain foods to survive or whatever, but through their activities, always stewarded by the tribes. Once those cultural stewardship was removed, like tribes were removed from their land, or they were told by settlers they could no longer set fire to land, that caused massive anthropogenic changes to the land. And then I call it a double change because settlers didn't only take away the native influence, they also imposed a, American or Euro-American influence, however you want to call that. So they began modifying rivers, creeks, and making them into sort of mill races, changing directions, taking all the woody debris and rocks out of the rivers to make areas for boating and for movement of products up and down rivers, and putting in monocrops in terms of agriculture. And so this radically changed our whole landscape to something that's completely different than whatever was. So this eliminated the food sources for the tribes. It caused them to sort of begin to starve in many areas. And then later on, dams, dredging happened. The loss of the prairies caused many losses to Native peoples who began to beg at the houses of settlers because they no longer could actually gather the food for the winter they needed. And so, and they were then labeled thieves because when they were refused food, when they begged at the houses, they began stealing food to survive because their original foods are all gone. So this is part of the picture of why of the culture and the history of brought upon by anthropogenic changes by the settlers, changes to rivers, changes to lands, and the loss of food and land, loss of diversity on land that had sustained people for tens of thousands of years. When people moved on to the reservation, it wasn't actually much better. They were told they live a better life, have more food. It was perhaps a little more safe. They were not attacked by anybody, but they lived pretty much in poverty for the first 20 years. It wasn't until 1872 that they were actually able to get a piece of land and began farming it like they were told they had to do to make their own food. So they were not then self-sufficient until the 1880s. And so many people died in that period of some 20 to 30 years because they were basically living in poverty. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have any rights for anything. They were not even U.S. citizens, so they didn't have any rights to even sue the government really for anything. On the reservation, they began their own sort of reservation economy with making crafts, selling it as they could. When they got land finally, they were within 10 years, they were self-sufficient, according to the agents. They became actually very good farmers and actually were hired by other farmers in the area to do work for them. But many people went into becoming indigenous farm workers. They were the first population of indigenous migrant farm workers in the valley, traveling around to different farms to gather. They would get passes almost all times of the year to return to their home area and fish or gather foods or hunt as they would. Fishing was a big activity because there wasn't a lot of fishing opportunities at Grand Ronde, the reservation, so they would leave to go to the coast to fish, or there are records of people from the Clackamas and other peoples on the Columbia getting a pass for 2 weeks to go to back to their home territory and fishing and doing their normal activities again. But they had to do this with the pass because again, they were not U.S. citizens. So they were very much like immigrants, what we call illegal aliens today. Many people decided to leave the reservation when they could, when they had the skills. Many of them became timber workers, went in the timber industry. Some people decided to sort of basically stop identifying as a native and start identifying as white. And when they did that, they actually were able to actually get jobs and make twice the wages they would have at the reservation for doing the same job. Rights did not come until they were citizens in 1924 under a Indian Citizenship Act. So that's some of the information about them there. I ended here. There's more to be said about this story. You know, Grand Run was terminated in the 1950s, restored in the 1980s. So Grand Run is kind of restoring in many ways its rights, its presence on the land, and having to sort of restore itself in the eyes of a lot of folks, you know, governments, you know, cities, what have you, because a lot of folks are not used to Grand Ronslets having been restored only about 30 years ago again. So many people, when I was younger, many people would come up to me and say, you know, your people are extinct. You no longer live anymore in here. It's because we had been terminated. That doesn't mean we went extinct. We're still around. We're all living in the cities and getting jobs and eventually going to college like anybody else. We just didn't, for a while, didn't have a tribe. So now we do, and now we're reestablishing our sort of sovereignty in the area. So, and there's a lot more to be said, but I think I should open it up for questions now, and I'll go ahead and stop my share here.
Mike, I think you are on mute if you're speaking to us.
Thank you, Carrie. I didn't want to disturb anybody, but thank you, Dr. Lewis. It was amazing. Terrific presentation. Many things that are just completely brand new to many of us, I'm sure, but probably not all of us. There may be questions today. Anybody have any questions for Dr. Lewis?
I do.
Go ahead.
I saw your presentation when you did it to the format, and I was impressed then, and I'm even more impressed because there's so much information that I think that I could watch it 3 or 4 more times and pick up all that's there. I'm working on a Vanport place marking project, and of course that's a site where Native Americans habitated for, like Carrie said, time eternal. Is there the problem that I've run into, and this has been educational, is different sources have different parts of this story of what happened. And we want to make representative historical signs that's tied to data. And can you tell me a place? I mean, now you had said, look at the Lewis and Clark journals, and we've done that a bit. But for instance, I've heard various versions of the story that you said the tribes coexisted in peace and there was no warfare or territorial battles. I've heard that, and I've also heard that there were territorial battles because it was such a rich land and because it was so treasured. And do you have a source that you could offer, and this can be offline or however that works, that we could use in our historical signage?
I can help you develop that. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't have it. I mean, I've
Yeah.
done that before. So
is it okay to contact you and have that discussion about the signage?
yeah, I think that there are plans for further development of more sort of cultural ideas, cultural information for your organization.
Okay.
I think there's going to be planned at some point a meeting to talk about what kinds of things you guys want to do.
Right,
probably
'cause-
finish my report. I think that there's a review of the report needs to be happen, and but you know, there are going to be various versions of history. Some of that is put out nowadays by political operatives who are attempting to sort of move into the Portland area because it's actually a very rich economy.
Yeah.
So I would be wary looking at all these sort of political statements from different tribes saying various things without understanding the deeper history.
Okay, that's very helpful because having you make this presentation, I think, helps enlighten the people to what we've been learning, as well as, and you're probably familiar with Dave Ellis at the Willamette Cultural Resources Associates, and Paul Lumley, who I think's on this board, I'm not sure. But I think what I just wanted to comment on is how important what you're doing is to bringing the reality of what really was in Portland. I mean, and I don't think very many people do it. So thank you very much for your work, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
And Mary Helen, as Dr. Lewis has mentioned, we are going to work to get the report finalized and available. And so there may be information in that report that is covering the same content as his presentation today. That would be something that you might reference, but certainly not to discourage you all from working together directly. And
okay. Well, yeah, and before Karen's departure, we were working together, and MCDD sponsored some of the design of signage that's now including just mention of, but we're going to have a specific people of Vanport kind of sign. So, if more people work together to do the signage, more people will be informed and we'll all be better off for it. So.
Couldn't agree, Mary Helen. Couldn't agree more. Dr. Lewis, we've got a couple other things on the agenda. I just want to thank you so much for this. And, we're a fairly unique new local government that actually has a charge of being responsive to the cultural history of the area. And so I have no doubt I'm sure this will not be the last time we talk on how we can move forward and collaborate with others on raising up that history. So really, really appreciate your contribution today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, gang. Jim, I think you're next up on the agenda.
Standing between you and freedom, we have two more quick items, and I think they're actually really related to this, which is working together to try and come up with some better outcomes. And so with the lifting of mask mandates and some other opportunities that are emerging, it is my belief that you all would benefit from an opportunity to take some tours of our district's, collective districts' facilities, the things that are outlined in your assets and liabilities report. So we have arranged with our CRAC operations team a series of potential days when you all can get out on a boat and get out in a car and check out our stuff. So our awesome leader, Emily Robertson, is going to talk to you a little bit about how you can avail yourselves of an opportunity to take a tour with a few of your colleagues. Not so many that we have a quorum, but just enough to make it interesting and fun. So Emily, do you want to talk about how you'd like them to express their interest in joining us for a tour of our facilities?
Sure. So for our operations team does district checks on Mondays and Fridays. So they're available for tours Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, and we can do a morning, like starting around 9:30, or an afternoon starting, I think, around 12:30. And so I will send out a doodle poll to you all with some times, those times and dates over the next few weeks, and we'll just try to get them as full as possible. We can take 5 people on the boat at a time, which doesn't present any quorum issues. And then there may be some other drainage district or district staff kind of filling in those gaps as well. So you can expect a doodle poll from me tomorrow. And then if you can just send those back as soon as possible, we can get you all scheduled for a tour.
And I guess I would say that if these dates don't work, we're going to create additional dates because we want to get you all out. The second thing I want you to know, we don't have enough planning done, and it's a little early with the lifting of the mandates. But once we get through summer and people's vacation schedules have potentially settled a little bit, I'm going to be reaching out to you about some opportunities to get you together in person for some team building activities or some food or something. We don't have an explicit plan. So if any of you have concerns or hopes or dreams about getting together with your colleagues in real life, please share them with me, and we will attempt to set up several events that will allow you to get to know each other better and build a common sense of purpose that you already have, but I think we can actually inflect even more. If there are no questions on that topic, I want to move on to the next one and we can get you out of here. But I'm excited to get out on a boat. I haven't been out on a boat yet. But I have been on a district tour with Bill. It's really fun. And you really get a better perspective of what we're working with and the opportunities we have before us.
Yes, take the boat ride. I've been on several, so I won't take up a space, but it is very informative and a different view of the levy.
Seeing no additional questions, please avail yourselves of any tour opportunities. And if one doesn't work for you, let me know and we'll make something happen. The second thing, we are starting to sense there are a couple of board members who, for a variety of really excellent reasons, may need to move off your initial board. And so we wanted to introduce the ways that the opportunities you have to appoint new members for those who may choose to move on to other opportunities. And it's pretty straightforward in a not very straightforward sort of way. So with that, I will turn it over to Kelly Sherbo to let you know what the statute says about your authorities to replace board members who choose to move on. Kelly.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
Uh-oh.
We lost Kelly.
Well, this is very awkward. See if she can get back.
There she's trying right now, looks like. There she is.
There, that was really strange. Anyhow, for board members that choose to move on, even for the governor appointed board members, the remaining board members can appoint somebody to replace that position. The only requirement is that if that person fit into a category to begin with, so for example, if they were one of the representatives from the managed floodplain, if they were representing a nonprofit, they still need to meet that requirement. But other than that, this board would be able to appoint a new member to fill that position. There's no guidance as to how that would take place. So sort of the guardrails on that are that staff cannot select or petition for any particular person to be on the board. That goes against our the government ethics statute. So it would be up to the board, who does have leeway to do things like lobbying or recommending board members to fill those seats. And we would be happy as staff to go about gauging interest of specific people or giving information out, or however you think that would best, however you think we could best support you. But other than that, the process would be pretty open as long as it's board directed. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, and if you would like a recommendation as to a process, we can put something together for you as well.
And just to clarify for you, it's Paul Lumley has reached out and said he is candidly just trying to do too much and is on a number of boards and trying to run a very important organization. And so he's asking for some relief. So that's what prompted this conversation.
So Jim, Kelly, Emily, whoever, I think it would be best if in fact Paul is leaving, be best to send something out to all the board members about what category of appointment Paul filled. There are criteria around that. And at that point, I think it's asking people to think about who might be good to be on the board from that category that would fill those criteria. Since the governor made the original appointments, if it's one of those appointments, that we might reach out to the governor's office again and see, is there anybody who's applied that would meet that criteria? That also might be a way to see if there is someone also that could fill the role. But I think I'd love to hear from board members about anybody they know that could meet the criteria. And from then, I assume it would be just getting them onto an agenda where we could actually, getting some information about them out to everybody. And then if there is only one applicant, then we would probably look to see if we could vote on that at the soonest meeting after we know who that is. I'm winging it here, so I'm open to folks saying if they'd like a different process, or perhaps it would be best also if any of you have ideas about process that you get them to Emily so that we can put something together that most everybody agrees is a good process for filling a vacancy. So
who do we, if we do have suggestions, Do we just send those to Emily?
Yeah.
You,
I would say in the meantime, yes. Eric, you had your hand up?
I was just going to ask whether Paul had any suggestions of someone that he might recommend to, to take his chair.
That's good catch.
So he did recommend one person only. I lunched with him the other day, and he recommended Kathy Callan. Kathy is the executive director of the Columbia Slough Watershed Council for the remainder of this week. And then she's moving to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. She also serves on a different drainage district board and had some concerns about her capacity to serve on another board. She didn't say no, but she hinted strongly that maybe it wouldn't work out. So that's what I know from Paul's recommendation. I did ask him if he had any additional names. He promised he would think about it. Candidly, he also described his life. I don't expect to hear back from him, but one of you might be more persuasive.
Okay. Well, please send out the criteria that we need to think about, and then let's put our thinking caps on and try to find some names. And again, if you have suggestions about process, please send those forward too, so we can again try to follow some level of process that we all roughly feel comfortable with. So, and Jim, if the staff have ideas about how they think they'd like to process vacancies, we have bylaws. If the statute is silent on the replacements for the initial board, Kelly, we might want to think about, what would a process that we could adopt in bylaws, even as a temporary process while we're here and before the permanent board is seated. We might want to think about that, okay?
Yeah, I'll see if there's other process that we can copy from somewhere else that looks like it would work for us.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Anything else today, Jim?
I guess the last thing I want to just update you on, I know that homelessness is a concern for everyone, both from the humanitarian side and also from our operational side. We had a really good meeting with our colleagues from a variety of bureaus at the City of Portland. We're making plans to compassionately work with Cascadia Behavioral Health and others to ensure we have adequate access to our facilities without creating too much trauma for homeless folks. We're also making some progress Schmear Road, working with Cascadia and our partners to help give us some near-term access to some relief wells and doing some garbage cleanup. So we're working closely with City of Portland, Urban Camping Reduction Program, with the Joint Office on Homeless Services and others to ensure that we are both compassionate, but also ensuring the safety of our facilities. So more to come on that, but we are making some progress, and we appreciate the support of the City of Portland and the Joint Office and others who are helping us address what is a community-wide challenge that I know we all care a lot about. So more to come on that, but we are working hard to ensure we can maintain our facilities in a compassionate way. So progress is being made.
Appreciate that, Jim. You may already know this, but we at Bureau of Environmental Services have been working with Portland State. There's a pretty extensive report coming out in the next couple weeks from Portland State researchers working with our folks regarding our kinds of facilities, which interestingly match a lot of your kinds of facilities. And it comes with a bunch of findings and recommendations about what we might do to improve that situation. So I'll make sure you get that when it's released.
Great, thank you. There's an awful lot of work being done, and Commissioner Stegman, really appreciate what the county's trying to do as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. It's going to take us all for sure. All right.
Mike, is that the HRAC report
Yes.
at Portland State? Okay.
So I've kept you 6 minutes over the limit. Apologize for that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for continuing to work on our work. And it looks like in the next few months, it's going to get a lot more interesting. So, and we'll get to the meat of some of the matters. So hang in there, gang.
yeah, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank
take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye.